You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast. This is Brian Wood. Today we have our May market report, which will now be sponsored by Mercaris. Mercaris is the nation's leading market data service and online trading platform for organic and non-GMO agricultural commodities. At Mercaris.com, you can find up-to-date information on market conditions for organic and non-GMO commodities, including price breakdowns, import and export reports, and mapping tools. Additionally, the Mercaris trading platform allows buyers and sellers to meet online and trade physical commodities. Visit Mercaris.com now for more information. Also, we're excited Mercaris has made Ryan Koory, their Director of Economics, available to give the market update today and in the future. So that's who you will be hearing from now, and without further ado, let's get into it.
This is Ryan Koory. I'm the Director of Economics here at Mercaris, and today here to talk a little bit about what we see going on in the organic markets coming out of April and through the month of May. Some of the high-level trends that we've seen going on, looking at the path that imports have taken over the 18-19 marketing year and into the current 19-20 marketing year. One thing that we've seen and has continued into the month of April is the flow of soybeans and soybean meal into the U.S. has been a little bit slower compared to what we saw over the past marketing year. And that trend we saw kind of continue into April. We saw particularly whole bean imports, organic whole soybean imports, they dropped off pretty substantially. And that's really due to the fact that imports from Argentina are starting to slow down seasonally. Generally, over the second and third quarter of the marketing year, organic soybean imports from that country slow down. And with that country slowing down, some of the primary places that we sourced soybeans from in the past have not been quite as robust in terms of their shipments this year, primarily looking at India and the Black Sea for those sources. So overall, the whole bean picture has tightened up a little bit over April. Soybean meal imports, we continue to look at India being the dominant source of those imports, but with kind of like what we see within the whole soybean complex, some of the other trade partners that we've seen supplies come from in the past, China and Turkey specifically, they've trimmed their exports to the U.S. over this past year. So looking at general soybean imports, that combined whole bean and meal import picture, we kind of have seen both of them trend a little bit lower this year, and that trend carried into the month of April. In contrast to that, looking at whole corn imports and cracked corn imports, we've actually seen a bit of a reversal of what we've seen over the past year. We saw in the month of April, we estimate organic whole corn imports jumped pretty substantially from the previous year, hitting nearly 30,000 metric tons. With those imports coming in, we've seen the organic corn market remain pretty soft this year. One of the trends that's been a bit of a difference looking at corn is the switch we've seen from cracked corn and whole corn. Prior to this marketing year, this 1920 marketing year, we've seen cracked corn imports continue to swell and become the dominant supply of imports into the U.S. And we've actually seen those trim back a little bit this year compared to where they were over 18-19. In contrast with those whole corn imports over the 18-19 marketing, or the 19-20 marketing year rather, they've continued to grow and they've substantially outpaced where they were last year. And a lot of what's driving that growth is we've seen a shift in trade sources when we're looking at whole corn. Prior to the 1920 marketing year, if we're looking at, this time last year, we were talking about a pretty substantial source coming from the Black Sea region, Turkey, Ukraine, Romania. And those have come to a pretty substantial, they've been reduced pretty substantially. In lieu of those, we've seen imports from Argentina take off. And kind of like what we see with soybeans, generally imports from Argentina, when you're looking at organic whole corn, they kind of slow over the second and third quarter too. However, they continue to show just remarkable strength over last year, and it's adding a lot to that organic corn import picture. So taking that whole organic corn import picture perspective, we're continuing to see this year's imports. Essentially, we're pacing just about even with last year, just maybe modestly above what we had over the 18-19 marketing year. Taking and looking at what's going on the livestock side of things, April was a bit of a rocky month in terms of what we saw for organic broiler slaughter. The data that we look at from the USDA indicated we saw about a 24% year-over-year reduction in that organic broiler slaughter federally inspected organic broiler slaughter number. And with that 24% year-over-year reduction, there's a bit of a story in there, because prior to April, we were actually looking at about a 2 to 3% increase year-over-year if you're looking at the month of March. And so with that drop, we're asking the question of, where did these birds go? We're not 100% sure that they were actually left the system necessarily, but it's one of those things that we watch to see what the implications will be for the market. If they've been culled or they generally weren't slaughtered, then we could see that culminate in some pretty bearish pressure for prices as we look at the spring and summer months. However, if there's some kind of data anomaly or something else going on in the market, and we see these numbers recover pretty quick, then we could continue to see broiler slaughter range higher year over year. Egg layers are kind of facing right where they were at the same point last year. Again, looking at USDA organic cage-free numbers, we're looking pretty much flat year over year at about 15.7 million head layers in the month of April. Organic dairy numbers are a little harder to track down, but we have seen organic dairy prices trending higher over April and into May, gaining about 56% year over year for a half gallon of retail price milk. And a lot of that's due to the fact that we've had some constrained supply chains in the grocery store, adding a lot of pressure to the demand side and putting some constraints on supplies being able to get in there and fill that need, and adding some upward pressure to prices. Kind of backing out of this whole thing into looking at it from a market price perspective, looking at the first 2 weeks of the month of May, we've seen the organic corn price come in right below $8 per bushel. And that's pretty much indicative of what the trend that we've seen in the market so far over this marketing year. Kind of looking back around January, we were looking at prices that were struggling to hit about $9. And then by March, they were floating around the $8 to $8.50 mark. And so looking at May, we've continued to see that bearish price situation develop and put downward pressure on prices, and at this point we're struggling to hit $8 per bushel for U.S. feed grade organic corn delivered to your local grain terminal. Soybeans tell a bit of a different situation. They've been floating pretty close between the $19 to $20 per bushel mark over the first 2 weeks in May. We're looking at about $19.25 per bushel delivered for organic feed grade soybeans delivered to your local elevator. And that's pretty consistent with where we saw the marketing year open, and where we've seen it trade pretty much since the start of 2020, really.
Is that corn price being down, is that being affected by still 2018 inventories, or is that coming back to the bullish imports?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both, to be completely honest. We've seen imports they've performed stronger than we would have anticipated, given kind of the market conditions. We had expected, well, frankly, if you're looking back at last year's harvest, a couple of things happened. Number one, everybody knows we had a reduced corn harvest. That's not that it's surprising. But as you just alluded to, we actually wound up carrying a whole bunch of corn into this marketing year. On top of that, the corn harvest wasn't quite as bad as we expected it to be. We had a whole lot of new organic operations pop up in the United States. And so even though on an individual operation basis, we actually saw the number of acres get harvested, they were trimmed a little bit and yields were down, but we had enough new operations that we actually only saw corn production dip a little year to year. So you add the fact that we had a lot of corn carried into this year, and production was a little bit better than a lot of folks were anticipating. And you add to that the fact that we've seen, organic corn imports from primarily talking about Argentina, they've been pretty robust. All of those things have kind of culminated in a market in which prices have just been soft.
And how much of the importing, I heard mention of India, China, how much is being impacted by the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, the pace of imports hasn't really been impacted by COVID yet, and that's a bit of a time lag issue. Well, maybe it's not fair to say it hasn't been imported yet. We haven't seen the data that suggests that it's been impacted yet. A lot of these ports began to shut down or restrict mobility right around the end of March, beginning of April. Well, if you take the amount of time it takes for a container to make it across the sea, you're really talking, about mid-March into June before you're going to start to see import numbers drop off as a result of COVID. And, we're definitely watching those, but it's too early to call it. I would say I wouldn't be surprised to see some kind of restriction on imports, particularly for soybeans, as a result of COVID. And that's due to the fact that so much of our organic soybean imports are in the form of soybean meal, and they come from India, particularly if you're looking over the remainder of this 1920 marketing year. India, they've enacted some policies in terms of limiting in-country mobility. Their ports have remained open, more or less. However, with their ports being open, they are limiting the ability to move freight in and out of ports. So effectively, you can get a ship in and drop something off, or you can get a ship in and pick something up, but getting in and out of that port space has become very difficult. And with that being the case, it's hard to get empty containers to ship stuff out, number one, and number two, it's hard to get goods into the port to ship them out in the first place. So I would say that there's risk for Indian imports to get trimmed as a result of COVID, depending on, how severe the situation becomes and how much longer these restrictions persist. I know some of them have been backed off already, but, I would say over the next 6 weeks, we're probably most likely to see the most substantial impact. The rate that things are going now, we could probably start to see things return to quote-unquote normal if we do see a disruption by the end of June, but we just haven't seen anything yet.
As far as milk and beef prices, we heard that milk prices are trending up, at least retail numbers, and then beef slaughter is down. We've heard from the COVID pandemic as well that, obviously the slaughter facilities have been affected significantly. Mm-hmm. But when we've heard that, we've heard primarily of some of the very, very large processors that are being affected and being shut down. Is organic being affected? Is organic production being done in those facilities, and is that what's affecting the slaughter numbers being down?
Yeah, in terms of why the slaughter numbers are down, it's really difficult for us to say or point to a specific catalyst. We just don't have the data that would say one way or another if it's a reduction in slaughter capacity or if there's something else going on. To your question of do some of these facilities run split lines, there's not a whole lot of organic beef or pork slaughter in the U.S. It's pretty minimal. So those closures really don't back up into the organic supply chain too much. It's really talking about the poultry and specifically the broiler operation. We haven't heard from our sources that there's been any substantial closures or any kind of substantial liquidation of organic broiler herds. However, at the same time, the numbers that we get from the USDA do indicate that slaughter number dropped pretty substantially over the month of April. Some of that could be due to the fact that these plants are having difficulties with getting birds through and operating processing lines, either due to COVID or due to labor-related issues because of COVID. But frankly, one of the unfortunate realities is there just isn't enough clarity in terms of what's going on within that sector to point to exactly what's driving that number down.
Well, is there anything else to report today?
No, really from where we're sitting in mid-May, I would say the risks that I watch out for are, number one, planting's looking pretty good so far. I think the last time I looked, we were sitting well ahead of where we were last year for sure, but even ahead of the 5-year average in terms of our pace of planting. This spring's pretty wet, pretty cold, but not nearly as bad as last year, and it does seem to be keeping tractors out of the field. The real risk factors right now are, as we talked about, what's going on with the livestock processing side of things, and then, what shakeups we see with respect to the import side of things. And then, how all that relates back to prices. And in terms of watching prices, that's one of the key things we do here at Mercaris. We run a market price survey in which we collect actual delivered prices to first handlers for organic corn and soybeans, wheat, various organic small grains, and try to get that information back out to the market so people within the market can make informed decisions about their operations. Any growers or producers who are interested in finding out more of our pricing information, they could log on to mercaris.com/farmer and sign up for our free farmer report. That includes a pricing report that we send out twice a month, the first and third Tuesday of every month. Gives you a 2-week running average of what the organic wheat, corn, and soybean prices look like in the U.S., as well as some brief market commentary around that stuff.
Well, great report, Ryan. Good information, and thanks for being on, and we'll have you back in June.
I look forward to it. Great talking with you guys.